In September 2006, one of Britain's biggest furniture retailers was sold for £1. Not 1 million, not 1,000. One coin passed across a boardroom table for a company that had spent 40 years putting kitchens and bedrooms into British homes. At its peak, MFI supplied so many kitchens that people joked 1 in 3 Sunday roasts in Britain was cooked on an MFI hob, and more than half the country's children were conceived in an MFI bedroom. Flat-pack boxes filled retail parks from Aberdeen to Plymouth. A generation learned what an Allen key was because of this one company. 2 years after that £1 sale, on a cold November night in 2008, MFI collapsed for good, just 40 minutes after Woolworths, on what became known as one of the darkest nights in British retail history. How does a company sell for less than the price of a sandwich and still take 2 more years to die? This is the story of MFI, a business killed twice, once by the market and once by the people running it. Before they ever sold a single wardrobe, Noel Lister and Donald Searle sold war surplus. In the years after the Second World War, that was how resourceful young men made a living in Britain, buying up army tents, blankets, tools, whatever the military no longer needed, and moving it on at a profit. It was a trade built on finding value in things everyone else had already written off. That instinct never left either of them. By 1964, Lister and Searle turned it toward furniture instead. They founded a company and called it Mullard Furniture Industries. The name carried a quiet, personal detail that never once appeared on a shop front. It was borrowed from the maiden name of Searle's own wife, a business built on a marriage, before it was ever built on a balance sheet. Britain in the mid-1960s was a country furnishing itself from scratch. New housing estates were spreading out from every major city. Young couples were setting up first homes with second-hand savings and first-time wages. The traditional furniture shop, solid wood, high prices, built to be handed down a generation, had nothing to offer them. What they needed was furniture they could actually afford now, not furniture worth inheriting later. Lister and Searle's answer was blunt and brilliant. Furniture that came flat in a cardboard box, went together with a spanner and a printed sheet of instructions at a price an ordinary wage could stretch to cover. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't meant to be. It was aimed squarely at people who had been priced out of anywhere smarter. The company floated in 1971 as MFI Warehouses, bringing in an outside manager, Derek Hunt, to steer its growth. The word warehouse was chosen deliberately. It told customers exactly what to expect the moment they walked through the door. No hushed carpets, no salesman in a blazer, no pretense, just rows of stacked boxes, prices on tickets, and furniture you carried out yourself. For a young family walking into one of those early stores, it felt like nothing else on the British high street. There were kitchen and bedroom sets built up on the shop floor so shoppers could see exactly what they'd be taking home. There were staff who talked in plain terms about price and delivery, not craftsmanship and heritage. For people who had spent their lives being quietly made to feel they didn't belong in a proper furniture shop, MFI felt like being served rather than judged. That was the whole of it, distilled to a single belief: furnish the home first, worry about elegance later. It was a modest ambition. It would carry the company further than either founder likely imagined. And, without either of them knowing it yet, it would also plant the exact seed that would one day help bring the entire business down. By the 1980s, MFI was no longer the scrappy alternative to the traditional furniture trade. It was the trade, at least for millions of ordinary British households who had never set foot in anywhere smarter and had no wish to. For families across the country, a trip to MFI had its own rhythm, and it followed a very particular kind of news: a house move, a wedding, a first baby needing its first proper room. The whole family piled into the car and drove out to the retail park, and the sheer scale of the place was part of the thrill. Aisle after aisle of kitchen units and wardrobe fronts, a size the old high street shop could never have matched. Children ran between the display bedrooms while their parents stood arguing gently over laminate finishes. Then came the part that has since become genuine British folklore: getting it home and putting it together. The flat-pack box wedged into the boot of the car. The Sunday afternoon spent on the living room floor with an Allen key and a set of instructions that never quite matched the parts in the bag. a father muttering under his breath at a wardrobe door that refused to sit straight. It was maddening. It was also, for a great many families, one of the very few pieces of home improvement they ever did together. A shared, slightly chaotic initiation into a new life under a new roof. The joke about MFI kitchens and MFI bedrooms? That a third of the nation's Sunday roasts were cooked on one of the company's hobs, and well over half its children conceived in one of its bedrooms, was repeated so often through the 1980s and 1990s that it stopped sounding like a joke at all. It became something closer to a national fact, casually accepted and endlessly recycled. It captured in a single irreverent line exactly how deep the brand had burrowed into the ordinary private texture of British life. This was not a shop people visited occasionally. It was the shop that had furnished the very rooms in which people actually lived. Part of that fame came from somewhere far less flattering. In the 1980s, the BBC's new consumer watchdog program sent a crew to investigate a kitchen MFI had advertised at £600. A kitchen that, once the small print was read properly, did not include the appliances shown gleaming in the display. When the television crew arrived at a branch to ask a few straightforward questions, they were met by a manager and told in no uncertain terms to leave the premises. The clip became one of the most quoted moments in the program's early history. From that point on, MFI's name carried a second meaning alongside the flat-pack furniture, a certain reputation for being defensive, evasive, not always straightforward about what a price actually included. Strangely, even that notoriety kept the company in the national conversation. People who had never bought so much as a shelf bracket there still knew exactly who MFI was and had an opinion ready. Inside the stores, staff lived through their own version of the boom. Those who joined as teenage sales assistants in the late 1970s watched their branches expand year on year, watched the delivery vans multiply outside, watched retail car parks fill to capacity every single Saturday. Selling on the shop floor meant kitchens to newlyweds, bedrooms to growing families, and, increasingly, furniture for an entirely new kind of customer. The first-time buyer, product of the era's rising home ownership, furnishing a starter home on a starter's wage. MFI's arrival at the Maryhill Shopping Center in the West Midlands in 1985 as one of its very first tenants captured exactly where British retail was heading in that decade, away from the traditional town center and out into vast purpose-built shopping landscapes, with MFI planted near the center of that shift almost from the beginning. Within a few short years, Maryhill had grown into one of the largest shopping complexes in the whole of Western Europe. MFI had grown right alongside it. What made all of this feel irreplaceable to the people actually living through it was never craftsmanship, and it was never luxury. It was reliability joined to access. A family could walk in on a Saturday morning and walk out that same afternoon, furniture in the boot, having spent an amount of money that didn't require months of careful saving beforehand. For a country still climbing out of decades of rationing and post-war austerity and living memory, that kind of straightforward, affordable abundance felt like real, tangible progress. What was it exactly about a flat cardboard box and a set of confusing instructions that made an entire generation feel, however briefly, however imperfectly, that they had finally arrived somewhere better? But even at its highest point, the foundation MFI had built itself on was already beginning to crack. Quietly, a little at a time, in ways almost no family standing in a showroom in 1985 could possibly have noticed. MFI's growth through the 1970s and into the 1980s was never simply a matter of opening more branches of the same shop. It was a series of deliberate, increasingly aggressive corporate maneuvers, each one adding another brand, another supply chain, another layer of complexity to a business that had started life admirably simple. In 1982, the company that owned the well-regarded kitchen brand Hygiena was looking to wind itself down and sell the name on. MFI moved in, buying Hygiena jointly with a smaller kitchen manufacturer. On paper, it made perfect sense. Bring a respected kitchen name under the MFI roof, add manufacturing capacity, strengthen the product range beyond flat-pack bedroom furniture. 5 years later, in 1987, MFI took full control of Hygiena outright. paying £200 million to buy out its co-owner entirely. It was a striking sum, and it signaled just how seriously the company was now playing the acquisition game. That same period produced one of the stranger chapters in MFI's corporate history. A partnership with the supermarket giant Asda struck in 1985. The idea in theory was to combine MFI's furniture retailing with Asda's supermarket muscle and footprint. In practice, it never found its footing. Concerns over the future direction of the business led both sides to dissolve the arrangement. And in October 1987, MFI's own management bought the company back outright in what was, at the time, one of the largest management buyouts Britain had ever seen. A year later, in November 1988, the company added yet another familiar name to its stable, acquiring Schreiber Furniture outright. Each of these moves widened MFI's footprint and deepened its brand portfolio. But they also widened something far less visible to any customer walking through a showroom: complexity. A business that had started with two ex-servicemen selling flat-pack furniture out of a single format now carried multiple brands, multiple manufacturing operations, and a corporate structure stitched together through a decade of acquisitions rather than slow, careful, organic growth. The physical expansion followed the shifting geography of Britain itself. As out-of-town retail parks multiplied through the 1980s, MFI planted itself in almost every one of them, riding the very same wave that was steadily pulling the nation's shopping habits away from the traditional high street. For customers, this meant an MFI within easy driving distance almost anywhere in the country. For the business itself, it meant a rapidly growing bill for long-term property leases, commitments that would prove extraordinarily difficult to unwind decades later, when the tide of British retail eventually turned against exactly this kind of out-of-town model. Inside the company, meanwhile, something far smaller and far less celebrated was quietly taking shape. Something that would matter enormously to MFI's eventual fate, though almost nobody paid it any attention at the time. In 1995, a trade-focused kitchen depot business was developed as a small unit within the wider MFI furniture group, starting out with just 14 depots and selling kitchens directly to builders and tradespeople rather than to the browsing public. It was unglamorous. It generated no headlines, no advertising campaigns, no cultural jokes about Sunday lunches. It would not remain small for long, and it would not remain part of MFI for very much longer either. For the people working inside MFI's expanding empire through these years, growth meant genuine, visible opportunity. Promotions from shop floor to store management, new depots opening that needed staff to run them. A company that seemed, from the inside, to be in a permanent and reassuring state of forward motion. What almost none of them could see, what almost nobody outside a small circle of boardroom decision-makers could see, was how much of that motion was now being driven by financial engineering rather than by satisfied customers simply coming back for more. The MFI that entered the 1990s was bigger, more diversified, and far more heavily committed to expensive property leases than the MFI that had entered the 1980s. It had never been more visible on Britain's high streets and retail parks. It had also never been more complicated to run, and though nobody inside it yet had any reason to suspect it, never more exposed to a shock it hadn't yet had to face. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, MFI had achieved something few retailers ever manage. It had stopped being merely a successful business and become part of the country's shared vocabulary. A name that needed no explanation at all, understood in exactly the same way by grandparents, parents, and children alike, as simply where you went for a kitchen or a bedroom. The clearest evidence of that saturation was the joke that had, by this point, hardened into genuine national folklore, that a third of the country's Sunday roasts were cooked in an MFI kitchen, and well over half its children conceived in an MFI bedroom. It is a strange kind of fame for a furniture retailer to hold. Not admiration exactly, more a wry, affectionate recognition that this one company's products had quietly become the backdrop to millions of private, entirely ordinary British lives. Few brands ever earn a joke that specific. Fewer still have it repeated, unprompted, for 30 years running. Generational transmission ran through MFI in the most literal way imaginable. Parents who had furnished their first flat there in 1974 took their own grown children to furnish student rooms and first homes there in 1994. The wardrobe assembled badly by a father one wet Sunday in 1978, door hanging slightly wrong, one screw permanently missing, became, 20 years on, a piece of family folklore retold every Christmas. MFI wasn't simply supplying furniture across generations. It was quietly supplying the raw material of the stories families told about themselves. Staff who lived through this peak described something more than job satisfaction. There was real, unforced pride in it. Store employees weren't selling aspiration or luxury to people who already had plenty. They were helping young families and first-time buyers put a home together on a stretched budget, and there was genuine dignity in that work. For many who joined as teenagers, an entire career could be built without ever leaving the company, shop floor to supervisor to store manager, as the business kept expanding fast enough to make room for them. MFI's presence in the retail parks it helped to populate gave it a strange kind of civic weight, too. Its stores were so often among the first tenants of a newly built shopping development that the surrounding businesses, quite literally, oriented themselves around it. In towns across Britain, "By the MFI" became genuinely useful local shorthand, a landmark ordinary people relied on for directions, whether or not they had ever bought so much as a shelf bracket there in their lives. Even the company's brushes with controversy folded themselves into that same wide cultural presence, rather than damaging it. The watchdog investigation into the 600-pound kitchen that quietly excluded the appliances shown in its own advertising, and the manager who marched the camera crew straight back out the door, became one of the program's most quoted early moments. It meant that even people who had never once shopped at MFI still knew the name and still had a story to tell about it. How many furniture companies in British history have ever earned a joke specific enough and beloved enough to survive 3 full decades of retelling? This was the high point, a company whose products sat, quite literally, in millions of British kitchens and bedrooms. A name that triggered instant recognition across every social class in every region of the country. A set of flat-pack boxes that had become, almost without anyone deliberately planning it, part of the physical furniture of ordinary British family life. What follows is the story of how a business can be loved this widely, remembered this fondly, embedded this deeply into a nation's private life, and still not survive the decade that came next. Nobody browsing the kitchen displays at an MFI store in the late 1980s had any reason to think the good years were numbered. But two very different forces were already converging on the company at almost exactly that moment, one arriving loudly from outside its walls and one growing silently within them. The external threat had a name, and it arrived in Britain in October 1987. IKEA. The Swedish retailer brought a version of flat-pack furniture that MFI's own founders might well have recognized as their own idea, sold back to the same customers. Affordable, self-assembly, aimed squarely at the same young, budget-conscious households MFI had spent 2 decades cultivating as its core audience. Except IKEA wrapped the concept in Scandinavian design credibility and a shopping experience built around browsing, inspiration, and a certain aspirational gloss. Something MFI's blunt, warehouse-style model had never once tried to offer. Not long afterwards, the DIY giant B&Q also pushed hard into furniture and kitchens, becoming an unexpected second front in the very same battle. MFI, which had spent a generation as the default answer to "where do you buy a kitchen?", suddenly found itself facing two well-funded, well-regarded rivals offering their own version of exactly that answer. How long could a business built on being the only obvious choice actually survive once shoppers had other obvious choices sitting right beside it? The second crack was quieter, and in hindsight, considerably more damaging. Between 2004 and 2005, MFI suffered a run of serious IT failures that disrupted operations across the business, and crucially disrupted customer orders and deliveries at precisely the moment its competitors were sharpening their own service and reliability. The problems were public, widely reported, and corrosive in exactly the place a retailer like this could least afford it. Trust. When a family has already paid a deposit on a kitchen and is simply waiting for it to arrive, a company that cannot reliably tell them when that will happen has damaged something far harder to repair than a single bad quarter of sales. The fallout reached all the way to the top of the business. Both the finance director and the chief operating officer left the group in the aftermath. Underneath both of these visible wounds sat a structural problem that had been quietly forming since 1995, almost entirely unnoticed. The small trade kitchen depot business, tucked inside MFI's wider corporate group, the modest operation that would one day be known as Howden's, was proving year after year to be a considerably better business than the flagship retail stores that actually carried the MFI name. It sold directly to tradespeople rather than the public. It carried none of the costs of large, glossy out-of-town showrooms, and it generated the kind of steady, dependable margin that MFI's public-facing retail arm, weighed down by expensive retail park leases and now facing genuine competition on two fronts, was struggling more and more to match. By 2005, the figures made the trend impossible to disguise. Sales had fallen from $854 million in 2003 to $742 million just 2 years later. A serious, sustained decline for a company that, in the public imagination, still felt like an unshakable British institution. This was not yet a recession. The wider British economy was still relatively strong, with no downturn visible on the horizon. The decline belonged to MFI specifically, not to the market as a whole, and that distinction mattered. It meant the problem was coming from inside the company, not simply from the weather of the wider economy. And so, somewhere inside MFI's boardroom, a decision began quietly taking shape. Not a decision to fight harder for the customers the company was losing to IKEA and B&Q, and not a decision to reinvest in the stores and systems that had let those customers down. Instead, the response forming was a colder one. Begin separating the group's problems from its profits and work out which half of the business was actually worth saving. Few of the staff still selling kitchens to young families on a Saturday morning had any real sense that a decision of that kind was even being discussed above them, let alone that it would soon determine with brutal clarity which parts of the MFI story were allowed to survive and which were not. The decision that sealed MFI's fate was not made on a shop floor, and no customer browsing a kitchen display that year would ever have thought to ask about it. It was made in a boardroom, and it concerned something far less visible than furniture. Which half of the company was actually worth keeping? By 2006, MFI's leadership faced a choice that had been building for years. The group now contained two fundamentally different businesses under a single roof. There was MFI Retail, the public-facing chain of stores that carried the actual MFI name, weighed down by expensive out-of-town leases, battered on two sides by IKEA and B&Q, and still recovering from the reputational damage of its own IT failures. And there was the Trade Depot business, born quietly back in 1995 with just 14 sites, which had by now grown into a genuinely valuable operation, selling kitchens directly to builders and tradespeople with none of the overheads or bad publicity attached to the retail stores. The solution chosen was surgical, and it was ruthless in its simplicity. In September 2006, MFI sold its loss-making retail business, the stores, the brand, the flat-pack warehouses that generations of British families had grown up walking into, to a private equity firm, Merchant Equity Partners, for £1, a single coin. In the very same transaction, the parent company renamed itself Galliform and kept the profitable Trade Depot business entirely for itself. Everything the public actually associated with MFI, the jingles, the watchdog notoriety, the Sunday lunch joke repeated at kitchen tables for 30 years, was handed to a new private owner for a token sum. The business quietly built inside MFI's own walls, the one nobody outside the company had ever heard of, was kept, protected, and set on a path that would eventually see it join the FTSE 100 under an entirely different name. From the perspective of shareholders and of the depot business retained inside Galliform, it was rational financial engineering. Separate the underperforming asset from the profitable one, and let each follow its own trajectory. From the perspective of a store manager who had spent 20 years building a career inside MFI's retail arm, or a delivery driver who had never worked anywhere else in his life, it meant that the company he had helped build now belonged to someone else entirely, a private equity buyer whose interest in the business was, by its very nature, financial rather than sentimental. Who exactly was responsible for protecting a business and the people inside it once that business had been reduced to a £1 line item in someone else's balance sheet? Under its new ownership, the retail operation did not find its footing. If anything, its troubles compounded. In September 2007, the company withdrew a television advertisement, one showing a wife slapping her husband across the face over an argument about a toilet seat left up, after complaints that it trivialized domestic violence against men. It was a minor scandal set against the company's deepening financial position, but it captured something telling about a brand that seemed, in its final years, to be stumbling over its own public image at every turn it took. By September 2008, with the retail business still bleeding money, its chief executive, Gary Favell, led a fresh management buyout of the very company Merchant Equity Partners had bought 2 years earlier. In the process, 81 of the company's remaining 191 stores were closed in a single move, a huge, sudden contraction that gutted nearly half the chain almost overnight, largely overshadowed in the press by the far larger financial crisis now gathering around the entire British economy that same autumn. The final blow arrived from a direction with no drama in it at all: credit insurance. As the 2008 financial crisis deepened through the autumn, the insurance protecting MFI's suppliers against non-payment was withdrawn right across the retail sector, and several of the company's key suppliers began to fail as a direct result. Unable to get paid, unable to get insured, unable to keep supplying. MFI, already weakened by years of decline, asked its landlords for one small mercy, a 3-month rent-free period, simply to buy time to work through the immediate crisis. The landlords said no. That single refusal, a modest request for a few months' grace, flatly denied, was the last domino standing. The company that had once been too beloved even to fail quietly, protected for decades by a national in-joke about the bedrooms and Sunday dinners of an entire country, was now weeks away from disappearing altogether. The end came in 2 acts 3 weeks apart, and it arrived alongside the fall of another British retail institution on the very same evening. On 25 November 2008, reports emerged that MFI stood on the brink of administration, with the company still hoping its landlords would grant the rent-free period it had asked for, simply to survive the immediate cash crisis. By the following day, it was clear no agreement would be reached. After a board meeting on 26 November 2008, MFI formally entered administration. Joint administrators from the restructuring firm MCR, Philip Duffy, Jeff Bouchier, and Paul Clark, were appointed to take control of what remained of the business. An official statement cited severe cash flow pressure driven by the withdrawal of supplier credit insurance and a general deterioration across the home retail market. The timing carried its own grim symbolism, the kind no scriptwriter would have dared invent. On that same evening, just 40 minutes apart, news broke that Woolworths, a retailer even older than MFI, with almost a century of history on the British high street, had also collapsed into administration, with debts of $385 million and 30,000 jobs hanging in the balance. Newspapers the next morning did not need to exaggerate a single word to call it one of the darkest nights British retail had ever seen. 2 names that had furnished and stocked British homes for generations had gone under within minutes of each other for many of the same underlying reasons: unsustainable costs, punishing competition, and a credit crisis that had turned ordinary financial pressure into something close to a death sentence. MFI's collapse did not happen all at once. In the immediate aftermath of the administration announcement, 26 of the company's 111 remaining stores were closed straight away, putting 260 people out of work in the run-up to Christmas. As bleak a piece of timing as a job loss can carry, the company said it intended to honor or refund existing customer orders, a small mercy for families who had already paid deposits on kitchens and bedrooms that might now never arrive. For 3 weeks, the rest of the business hung in a kind of suspended animation, while administrators searched for a buyer or any workable path forward. Store staff kept the remaining branches open through those weeks, not knowing, from one morning to the next, whether their own branch would be among the ones still standing by Christmas. No buyer came. On 19th December 2008, 6 days before Christmas, every remaining MFI store closed for the final time. All 111 of them. Total job losses reached around 1,200. For staff who had spent decades inside the company, some who had started as teenagers on the shop floor, back when MFI still felt unstoppable, it meant clearing out familiar showrooms, taking down familiar signage, and going home to a Christmas overshadowed by unemployment. For customers, the closure meant something smaller, but no less painful in its own quiet way. Kitchens ordered and paid for that would now arrive incomplete or not at all. Deposits caught somewhere inside administration proceedings with no clear route back. And beneath the practical loss, a stranger, more disorientating realization that a shop which had always simply been there, as familiar a fixture of the retail park as the road signs pointing towards it, was now quite suddenly not there at all. The company's own corporate structure ensured that almost all of this pain landed on one side of the business, and almost none of it on the other. Galliform, the renamed parent company that had kept the profitable Trade Depot business back in 2006, remained liable for the leases and closure costs of 46 legacy MFI properties, absorbing an exceptional charge of close to £100 million. Real money, certainly, but a fraction of what the retail collapse actually cost in jobs, in deposits, in a brand's entire reputation. The depot business itself, shielded from the wreckage by the very transaction that had doomed the shops 2 years earlier, carried on operating without so much as a pause. There was no dramatic final day captured by television cameras, no queue of loyal customers gathered outside a flagship store on its last morning. The way some closures are remembered for decades afterwards, MFI's ending was quieter than that and far more procedural. A board meeting, an administrator's statement, a staggered list of stores closing in stages over 3 cold weeks. But for the hundreds of thousands of families who had furnished a first home there, who had spent a Sunday afternoon assembling a wardrobe on the living room floor with a spanner and a badly printed instruction sheet, the disappearance still registered as something closer to a personal loss than a business story in a newspaper. By the last week before Christmas 2008, the company an entire generation had once joked belonged in almost every bedroom in Britain no longer had a single shop open anywhere in the country. In the years after MFI's stores went dark, the space it had occupied in British retail did not stay empty for long. IKEA and B&Q, the very two competitors that had helped erode MFI's position in the first place, absorbed much of the demand the company left behind. Newer, sharper kitchen specialists moved into the gap on Britain's retail parks, filling units that had stood empty only months before. The MFI name itself refused to disappear quite as completely as its stores did. Roughly 2 years after the collapse, a small family-run plumbing business bought the rights to the MFI brand from the administrators for $250,000, a modest sum for 3 letters that had once been attached to a company employing thousands. It relaunched MFI as an online-only retailer in November 2011, a very different proposition from the flat-pack warehouses of old, with no physical shops left to wander and no showroom floor to stand on. That version lasted less than 4 years, ceasing trading again in 2015. The brand was revived once more the following year, repositioned as a budget bedroom furniture range sold entirely through its owner's website, a shadow of the national institution it had once been, but still, remarkably, still carrying the same name. The starkest lesson of MFI's entire story sits in the contrast between its two halves. The Trade Depot business that had once been a minor, unglamorous unit inside the wider MFI group, the part quietly kept back in the 2006 restructuring, went on to thrive spectacularly under its new name, eventually joining the FC100, and in 2015 receiving a royal warrant as a supplier of fitted kitchens. The retail stores that actually carried the MFI name into millions of British living rooms, meanwhile, were the parts sold for £1 and left to collapse 2 years later. The company's most valuable asset and its most beloved, publicly recognized brand turned out, in the end, to be 2 entirely different things. Only one of them was protected. For the 200 people who lost their jobs in December 2008, the aftermath meant something far more immediate than any lesson in corporate restructuring. Some found positions with the very competitors who had helped drive MFI under in the first place. Others, particularly those who had built decades-long careers entirely within the company, faced a job market in the depths of the 2008 financial crisis, armed with a set of skills built around a brand that no longer existed anywhere on the high street. What does it actually mean in the end when a name that once furnished half the bedrooms in a country simply stops belonging to anyone who makes furniture at all? MFI's collapse became one part of a much larger story unfolding across British retail in the second half of the 2000s, a period that also claimed Woolworths on that very same night, and dozens of other familiar names in the years surrounding it. The broader lesson those closures left behind was never simply that consumer habits change, though of course they did. It was that a business can remain technically alive, still trading, still recognizable, still genuinely beloved by the public, for years after the decisions that actually determine its fate have already been made, quietly somewhere its customers will never see. Somewhere in Britain tonight, someone in their 60s is telling a grandchild about a Sunday afternoon spent on the living room floor, half a wardrobe assembled, half of it still lying in pieces, a father muttering under his breath at an instruction sheet that never quite matched the parts in the bag, the smell of new laminate and cardboard, the particular sound of a spanner slipping off a bolt for the fourth time, the small, stubborn satisfaction of finally standing the thing upright against the wall, door hanging just slightly wrong, and calling it finished anyway. The grandchild who orders furniture with a few taps on a screen and has it arrive fully built at the door will never know that exact frustration or that exact pride. But they will understand from the way the story is told that it was never really about the wardrobe at all. MFI was never selling elegance, and it never once pretended otherwise. What it sold for 4 decades was the plain and important idea that furnishing a home should not be reserved for people with money to spare. A kitchen, a bedroom, a wardrobe with a door that never quite closed properly. These were the ordinary building blocks of ordinary British lives. The first flat after a wedding, a child's first bedroom, a starter home bought on a stretched and careful budget. MFI placed itself, deliberately and successfully, at the very center of exactly those moments, for millions of families who had been quietly priced out of anywhere smarter or more polished. That was its real achievement, long before any balance sheet or boardroom decision entered the story. And it is precisely why a joke about Sunday lunches in bedrooms stayed funny and true for 30 years running. What the ending of MFI actually reveals has less to do with flat-pack furniture than it does with what a company can quietly become once it stops being simply a shop and starts being a set of assets to be separated, valued, and sold off in pieces. The half of the business that carried the name people loved was handed away for a single pound. The half that carried the actual profit was kept, protected, and allowed to flourish under a different name entirely. Somewhere in that gap, between the brand the public trusted and the balance sheet the company was actually run on, MFI was lost long before its doors ever physically closed. There is no need for anger in remembering it, and no single villain worth naming twice. There were simply people, founders who saw a gap in the market and filled it with something honest, staff who built entire careers and real pride inside stores that no longer exist anywhere on the map, families who still tell stories about wonky wardrobes at Christmas dinners, decades on, and eventually decision-makers who chose to save one half of a business and let the other half go for reasons that made perfect sense on paper and none at all to the people left standing in an empty showroom. The flat-pack boxes are gone from the retail parks now, replaced by other names selling much the same idea in a glossier wrapper. But the memory of driving out on a Saturday morning, coming home with a boot full of cardboard, and spending a Sunday afternoon turning it into a room a family would actually live in, that belongs to the people who did it. It is theirs to keep long after the company that sold them, the boxes, stopped existing at all.